All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the February Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about backups and disaster recovery planning. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series. We'd like to share a few webinar tips with you before we begin today. Most importantly, we'd like to encourage you to interact with us by asking questions via the GoToWebinar chat feature. We'd also like to remind you to avoid multitasking during the webinar. You may just miss the best part. If you do happen to miss the best part or need to leave the webinar early, we will be posting links to the recording and slides on our website, our YouTube channel, and our SlideShare account, and we'll be sending out links to those after the webinar. For those of you who aren't familiar with Community IT, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community. We've worked with over 950 nonprofits since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and culture of nonprofit organizations. And now, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters for today's webinar, Matthew Eshelman and Steve Longenecker, and they can introduce themselves.
Thanks, Johan. My name is Matthew Eshelman, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Community IT, and I'm happy to have just celebrated my 14th year anniversary with Community IT back at the end of January. And I'm happy to be joined again for this webinar by Steve Longenecker.
Hi, my name is Steve Longenecker, and I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT, and I've been at Community IT for 11 years, and also happy to be here with everyone and talk about this important topic.
Great. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and just get a little bit of a poll to gauge the size of the organizations in attendance today. So you'll see a poll here pop up. So if you're under 5 staff, 6 to 15, 16 to 35, 36 to 100, or over 100, it's always helpful for us to just gauge the kind of the size of the organizations because they often have some different requirements related to the topics at hand. And I think this is a topic that will be relevant to everyone, although there may be some differences in kind of the scale. So we'll leave the poll open for just another few seconds to give people a chance to click in the response before sharing the results here. So again, thanks for your participation. And it looks like we've got a wide distribution here, so a lot of folks in that 6 to 15 category, and then some even distribution around there. So thanks for taking a chance. We'll have another poll here in a little bit, but first I want to hand it over to Steve to talk through the agenda.
Thanks, Matt. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the value of data and just sort of setting the context for why backups and disaster recovery planning are important. We'll give you some baseline terminology so you can talk about these topics well. Then we'll be talking, the meat of our presentation is talking about what are the main elements of disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about Community IT's own experience with our own. We've done some planning. We'll talk about that and talk about one event that caused us to have to put some of our plan elements into place. And Matt, we have another poll, right?
That is right. So obviously we want to talk about backup and disaster recovery. So I'd love to get a sense for the audience today. How confident are you in your organization's backup and disaster recovery? So if you're very confident, maybe you can chat in and let us know some information about that. And hopefully, if you're a concern or if you don't have a plan, this will be a really great session for you to get some practical steps to building that plan. So again, we'll leave this open for just a few more seconds before we transition back to Steve. Great. So it looks like we've got folks who are in the right place, so 55% are concerned. We've got about a third who are confident or very confident. So hopefully you can learn something as well, or perhaps share something that the rest of the attendees can take advantage of. So great, Steve.
Yeah, so yeah, the context for this, of course, is that your organization's information is one of your most important organizational assets. Sometimes when we talk about security, we have clients who say, "Oh, no one's interested in my data. I don't need to worry about securing it." But obviously, your information is vital to you. And if you think about all the different kinds of information, we have a slide coming up on that in a few slides. But there's so many different kinds of information: financial information, information about your constituents, and so on. And that information, if you don't have access to it for even a short amount of time, it probably brings a lot of your operations to a standstill. So this is something that we need to plan around and make plans accordingly, that this information is something that we need to protect, and we need to take steps to make sure it's available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's no surprise that that we're doing this. Steve mentioned security as one of the key drivers, and our previous webinar was focused exclusively on the topic of security. And you'll notice once we have a foundation of security training and awareness, building on that, we really focus on passwords, antivirus, patching, and then backups. And so backups are a key component of security, and they're also a key component of kind of an organization's business continuity plan.
Yeah, I used to think I didn't necessarily think of backups as part of security when I first started working at community IT, which it was after all many years ago. I used to think of it as like, restoring things, files that staff people had maybe accidentally deleted, or maybe if a server crashed or something, you needed to recover from a backup tape back in those days. So I used to think of security as protection from hackers, viruses, maybe also like the permissions that you put on different folders in a network share so that only certain departments can access it and so on. That was what security meant to me. But I think, security is something more, a broader definition. It's guarding your IT against compromised data and IT service interruptions. So by that token, redundant power supplies on a server is an element of IT security, because it reduces the risk of an interruption to service by having two power supplies on your servers. So with that frame of reference, backups are important to security. They protect us against data loss, but also, if there's an interruption to data, can be remediated by a good backup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even in the news today was a report about a hospital in Hollywood that ended up paying a hacker, basically $17,000 to unlock their data, and it seems pretty clear that the reason they had to pay to kind of restore access to the network is because they didn't have a good backup system in place that would allow them to recover their data, and so. Backups as a form of network security is a really relevant and timely topic, and so I'm glad that we can have some time to talk about it today.
So some terms. Some of these we have talked about on other webinars, and certainly I've talked to lots of clients about this. But just so we all are on the same page, when you're talking about backups, there's two terms that come up a lot: RPO, or recovery point objective, sorry, is how frequently the data is backed up, and maybe the simplest thing to do here is just give an example. If you are backing up your file server once a week, let's say it's an old tape backup, you're doing it once a week, and something happens to that server or something happens to that data, and you need to recover that data from a tape backup or whatever, you potentially are going back a week in time. So you may be able to get it back up quickly, and you get it up fully, but because your tape was a week ago that it was made, you lost a week's worth of modifications to the data. So that would be a 1 week RPO, which by today's standards is probably way long. People talk about hours now more than days. RTO is recovery time objective, and this is how long it takes to do a recovery. So if, again, go back to your file server example, if it takes 4 hours to run that tape back up, then that's a 4-hour recovery time objective. That's how long it took. Your time objective might be, I want to be able to be up within 1 business day, 2 business days. Some of these things, have multiple factors at work and what can slow down a recovery, but simply just restoring, even if everything's in place and you're just restoring files, the throughput alone can sometimes set you back hours and hours, let alone if you have to replace a server first, then your recovery time objection goes much longer. Disaster recovery means to recover systems. Backups then are a component of disaster recovery. They're not the only part of disaster recovery, but they're an important component. And then business continuity is sort of the largest context for all of this. This, ability to continue to function after and during a crisis is business continuity. And so we were talking with our CFO today about this, just because he did some planning with us, with our company, a couple years ago, and he said, this is business continuity. This is not just disaster recovery. It's all about sort of focusing on that at that level of keeping your operations functioning. All right. So according to a 2014 study, 73% would receive failing grades for disaster readiness. And the question is, are you part of the 73%? So thank you to Dilbert for what I guess one piece of the 73% would say. This begs the question, what does it mean to get a passing or a failing grade in disaster readiness? And of course, that's what we'll be talking about for the rest of this deck.
Yes, exactly. I mean, so today more than ever, organizations have more data to protect and kind of in more locations than ever. So, the example is, as opposed to the data being in the file server down the hall, now we've got data in multiple systems that may be, in your office or not. So that can, include financial data, payroll information, email systems, software applications, business applications, constituent data, HR documents, and employee, and and much more. So obviously, just to make the case that kind of going through this process is not kind of just as simple as looking at well, how can we back up the server in our office, but it demands kind of a broader view of all the information systems where organizations place their resources.
Right. So it's not just what kinds of data are we keeping track of, but also where that data is stored. And I think in a perfect world, the data is either in a cloud service that is owned and managed by the organization, or on a server that is owned and operated by the organization. Obviously, there is data that has to be stored at least temporarily on laptops, and so thinking about what that means. I don't mean in all cases, but where there is a mobile workforce, laptops are in use oftentimes. And then we also want to mention shadow IT here. This idea that sometimes your data isn't even in places that you necessarily manage or control or even necessarily know about. Things like personal Dropbox accounts and stuff like that, where it's not necessarily sanctioned by the organization, but it is happening. Making business continuity plans around shadow IT is inherently difficult, if not impossible, but I think it has to at least be considered, and there needs to be an awareness of the fact that you probably know your organization as well as anybody does in terms of how much shadow IT is going on, but if there's a lot of it, then some of this business continuity planning may involve also thinking about reining in shadow IT.
Mm-hmm.
So defining a disaster recovery plan, we're going to talk about that now for a little while here. It's worth taking a moment here to say that disaster DR planning is more than an IT initiative. Again, the context for this is business continuity, and that's actually more than IT. And so this is something that probably needs to come from from leadership at the end of the day. It's also worth just talking about, what constitutes a disaster. I think sometimes, particularly in the context of backups, again, going back to sort of my early days of community IT, where we were backing things up with backup exec to tape, I was always, as a young net admin, thinking about, disasters, meaning that hard drives fail on a server. There was this sort of out of like this possibility that maybe the server room would catch on fire somehow, and that unlikely event was also sort of always sort of in my mind. But actually, if you think about disaster recovering, it needs to be a more comprehensive list than that. I mean, there's weather events. We just had snow interrupt operations at our clients here not that long ago in Washington, D.C., and that's, that happens every couple of years. Yeah, there's a catastrophic hardware failure. Utility-related events can happen. I had a client that their office went offline for a couple days when Pepco mashed the local electricity utility mashed up some main power line, and there were trucks out around a manhole for like a day and a half before the office had power again. And we're all familiar with the internet going out. I mean, that may not be a disaster if it's just a couple hours. You may think of that as business as usual or sort of normal operations, but it sort of all falls onto a spectrum. Telling stories, we once had a client who called us to say, hey, we're not sure what happened, but I came into the server room this morning and all of the network cables in the server room had been cut in half. And there was obviously some disgruntled staff person who'd had access to the server room somehow. That's kind of crazy, but it actually happened, so it's not impossible. And then there's external compromises, whether it's the CryptoLocker infection that Matt mentioned. We've had quite a few outbreaks among our clients at Community IT. I mean, not tons, but I'd say 1 or 2 a year is not unusual for us. It's just too easy for that virus to get in to networks. Also, stuff like that doesn't happen but could happen that we read about, like a flu epidemic. That doesn't affect IT, but it's definitely something that would impact operations and affect business continuity. Or here in the DC area, it's not something we like to think about, but even like a terrorist event is a possibility.
So in terms of planning for this, as Steve I think has already laid the groundwork for, planning for business continuity, backups and disaster recovery is not just an IT-related activity in a vacuum. This is something that needs to consider kind of the people aspects of your organization, a facilities aspect, and we're kind of familiar with dealing with that. Also equipment, and then finally, actually protecting the data elements in your organization. So, in quite a few of these scenarios that Steve referenced, a flu epidemic, maybe the data is fine, but you can't get to your office to do work. Same thing for a terrorist event or some other kind of natural disaster where you're physically cut off from accessing your resources, and if your entire organization is predicated off of going into a physical office location and performing work, then that could be an impact for how your organization thinks about continuing to operate. And I think thankfully, we haven't done a big disaster recovery planning webinar since I think about 2013, and I think at that point, a lot of the kind of thought or future projections around how the cloud could be used to address this, and I think that's certainly come to fruition in terms of the cloud can be a great resource for checking off the box around business continuity. It does open up the doors for a couple of other things to consider that we'll talk about down the road, but there's recognizing that this is not just an IT-related activity, and it really needs to be done in conjunction with senior leadership at your organization. And again, there are just things, unavoidable disasters happen everywhere. As Steve mentioned, here in DC, we're kind of snowbound for weeks on end. And it's interesting with the advent of the cloud and kind of the ability to do work from anywhere. A lot of organizations have adapted, and their policies reflect that. So, for example, here at Community IT, we never close, and so there's an expectation that if you do have access to network resources and you're kind of available to do that, your family's taken care of, then there's the opportunity to connect and to work and to be productive, and so that's part of the plan, and our IT infrastructure is designed in such a way that it is available broadly to staff no matter where they're located. And we talked about, we've got blizzards. The threats could be representative of a fire. That could impact the business. Could be something like a breach of data. Or for example, our very own brush with a fire in our building that impacted our ability to actually work in our location. So you can see a picture of our CFO. Kind of sending out some urgent emails with a couple inches of standing water behind him, and that was something that we experienced ourselves last August.
So, actually making a plan. These are the elements of business continuity planning. I won't read them all, but if you just, as you look at them, note that inherent in all these elements is a balance between costs and benefits. So if we didn't have costs, obviously we'd all choose the fastest recovery option with a scope that includes all operations at all levels. We'd test it once a week. We'd want everything because there's no costs, but there are costs. So we can't choose the fastest recovery option for everything because it's probably cost prohibitive. So we have to prioritize. We set our scope and we say, okay, we're gonna invest a lot in having a very minimizing the risks for one particular network or information system resource. It's most important to us. What keeps our doors open and keeps us going is the fact that we're rendering certain client services, and we use a tool for that, and that tool can only be down for an hour at the most. So that's going to be our priority. Access to the old file server, which really we don't use all that much anymore, is our lowest priority, and we're not going to invest as much in that. Which is not to say we're not going to invest at all, but maybe that's the thing that has the lower speed and has a time span where maybe that's not recovered until everything else is taken care of. So we're going to talk more about these elements in upcoming slides, but I do sort of want to keep in mind that that idea of balancing costs and benefits throughout these upcoming slides. And as we've said a couple times already, but because you don't have the unlimited ability to sort of prioritize everything, this does end up being more than an IT decision. It's an organizational-wide decision. It's a decision that should come from leadership. What are the priorities given the fact that we can't do everything at once?
As I mentioned earlier, the impact of the cloud as the last major push that we did, I think, around backup disaster recovery was back in 2013. And the point that we were making back then and still holds valid today is that the cloud doesn't equal backup. So just because you have your data in Salesforce or just because you have your data in Office 365 or Google Apps, in and of itself doesn't mean that you have a good backup of that data. So it's important to go into those solutions with that understanding. It can certainly be a very easy way to check off that box for business continuity, but it also opens up some new areas and new avenues and new terminology that it's important to understand related to kind of how your information can be accessed. And so that vocabulary is around SLA, or service level agreement. So often that speaks specifically around a vendor or provider's ability to provide access to the data, and that will likely include terminology around uptime. So for example, Office 365 has an uptime of 99.9%. So that means that there could be 8 hours of unanticipated downtime in a year, and that would still be relevant. And that's kind of the standard for most cloud services, is that 99.9% uptime. And then there's also vendor dependencies. So putting your data into a vendor's cloud system means you're kind of giving over that control. And with the major vendors, there's not a concern that they're going to potentially go out of business and kind of you'll be left holding the bag. But it does mean that it's important to look a little bit beyond just the service level agreement and what is the vendor promising to be able to provide, and look into a little bit of what's their ability to provide the service, what's their financial business model, how can they continue to operate as an organization. And so, as an example, fairly recently we had to do a lot of work to migrate email. So a vendor that a number of our clients were using, a hosted email vendor, basically decided they were, getting out of the business of that, and so they sold it. And so they had, a relatively tight turnaround to say, hey, we're going to be, closing our doors, and email needs to be migrated. So you need to, make those migration plans. So again, it's an issue of giving up the control to some extent means that you might be put in a position where you have to do a data migration to a new platform, maybe on a timeline that isn't convenient to you. So those are just some of the elements about the cloud.
I wouldn't call that, and I'm not contradicting you because we talked about this earlier, so that wouldn't be like a disaster recovery situation or even a disaster. There was no interruption in service when that vendor, they gave like 90 days notice, something like that, maybe more than that, but it was enough. It was enough time. It put a lot of pressure on us because we had a lot of clients moving at once, but we managed to accommodate everybody, and I think it all came out. But I mean, I do think I've heard of examples, not big ones, but of like small sort of niche cloud vendors who just they don't pay for they don't pay the data center for the electricity and the internet access, and one day it just gets turned off, and it turns out that the vendor is out of business. I think that would be a disaster, unanticipated disaster, even though it's a cloud service and you think it's not going to happen, that it could. I think it's worth saying a little bit more about cloud does not equal backup, because I would imagine that some people might have questions about that. I think if you take a vendor like Microsoft and their Office 365 service, they're a big reputable vendor, and their reputation is very important to them, and they are going to be doing backups, and you've said this in other webinars, Matt. They're going to be doing backups that sort of protect their SLA and protect them. So, again, back to my traditional understanding of backups as sort of a hedge against like a hardware disaster. Microsoft's, you can sort of count on them to take care of that. So if it's not that because it's Microsoft, servers never fail for them. I'm sure they have servers failing, at the same regularity that they fail among our clients too. There's probably like 1/10 of 1% of the servers go down every 6 months or something like that. It's a small number, but it does happen. They're big enough that they can scale and have redundancies so that we never even notice. And if something sort of out of that box happens that's unusual, like I don't know, a electrical storm that shuts down a whole data center for 4 or 5 hours, they have geo redundancies, or they even have backups to recover. So there is backups in cloud services. I think what you're talking about, Matt, or what this bullet point is talking about, is more what cloud services aren't focused on is sort of the other side, the customer side of backups, where it's caused more by, I don't know, I guess by end users. Let's say I'm syncing my OneDrive for Business account, which is a cloud service account, and it's synced to my laptop, and I have 300 gigabytes of important data in there, and I'm using it, la la la, and then I get a virus that wipes it all away, and so it deletes from OneDrive or encrypts it all away, and it's encrypted in OneDrive. That's not something that Microsoft is necessarily backing up, and having another third-party backup tool would be obviously of great benefit in that situation. Am I capturing that? I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of overview of the cloud services in general are going to be doing backups primarily for their protection. If you have unique requirements or requirements that don't match up exactly with what the vendor's providing, then it's important to look at that option. And I think the other thing is just I think that question of ownership and control. So if you want to get something restored from Microsoft, which we've had to work with them to do, it's not as simple as just picking up the phone and calling them and they do it right there. There's a very rigorous process that you have to go through, and so it makes it a lot more time-consuming process. So it makes it a lot more appealing to have a system that you can control to say, okay, well I need to restore this. I'm going to go ahead and just take care of it, as opposed to working on the vendor's process to go through. So great.
Okay, so this next slide now actually talk about the actual steps in creating a disaster recovery plan, and we're going to go over the different steps in upcoming slides. At this overview level, I just sort of want to mention that this is a somewhat resource-intensive process. I've mentioned that Community IT went through a business continuity planning process a few years ago. When I talked to our CFO this morning, he was guessing maybe 80 to 100 hours we spent on it all told. It was a while ago, so it's hard, to remember. And the other thing he said, and we need to update that. And I was like, yeah, I know we need to update that. It's something that needs to stay alive and be a living process. Significantly, in our case, this planning process was initiated by our board. Our board said that was important, that we have a business continuity plan in place, and charged us with making that investment of time and energy into making it happen. Key people from every business unit or team should be involved in this process. It's not something that you can have one person do by themselves in a silo, because no one person has enough of an understanding of all the different components of the business that they can do it effectively. And I think we'll talk about the other steps in more detail in upcoming slides. So yeah, the first step is establishing that planning group. And as I said, we do need to have members of this team or this group come from all the different operational parts of your organization. Leadership would be charged with prioritizing the which operational functions get the priority, and then the planning group, the members of the planning group would then take those priorities and make sure that they make sense of them. And it really is here that you can see why it's important to have lots of different members of the team working together, because no one person knows all of the different functions of your organization.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of risk assessment, I mean, this is really focused around assessing the impact for each role in the organization. And so for example, if crypto wall, if you get that virus, the impact to the organization as well. You can't have access to your files. So how does that impact staff? What are they going to be kind of? What's their response in that situation? And again, you can have different risks, and some risks would obviously have more impact than in others. So I think the risk assessment is really focused on kind of helping to build that quantifiable or build a business case around maybe where to make those investments if there's financial decisions to be made, and then also to kind of figure out, as a service, or what are you providing to your constituents, kind of what gets valued more highly and may require some additional investment in that area as well.
So application prioritization is the sort of the flip side of assessing your risks. And this is, again, something that leadership sort of needs to do. But you go through and you think about, and this is focused on like IT applications, but in some ways I would say you could talk about your operational functions as what leadership needs to prioritize, and then you as like the IT people think about the IT applications that support those functions. But this example puts them into 4 categories, ranging from mission critical to non-critical. But really you need to sort of think about all the different things that are happening, all the different things that could be impacted by a disaster, something that interrupts the normal operations, and then think about which ones sort of need to be fixed first because they're the most important to the organization, and which ones can wait. Because again, you can't do everything at once. And so having this all mapped out ahead of time really informs the rest of your plan, and also informs how you go about yeah, I said it again. This is what makes the plan take shape.
Yeah, and I think it's important that this is an exercise that's done kind of across teams or with kind of broadly in the organization, because maybe in me and my department, I think all my systems are mission critical, and everybody maybe thinks their own work or projects or programs are mission critical, and so it's important to have that kind of cross-team or kind of cross-departmental working group to really hash out the differences, and then make those judgments as to, yes, where does the investment need to go, or what do we need to prioritize in terms of making sure systems are restored access and protected effectively. And so kind of going through and being able to have some terminology to describe which system, yes, can we all agree that email is critical. For some organizations, maybe the phone system is the most mission critical application. For some folks, it might be their CRM system is the most critical. So this just gives you a platform and a framework to help make those business decisions as an organization, with IT providing some of that guidance and input into kind of the technical know-how to make that all happen.
And obviously, this is the kind of thing you want to do ahead of time. When you're in a disaster recovery situation where operations have been interrupted, that's not when you want to try to start taking the time to sort of figuring out, well, what's the top of our list, and that's a stressful situation. People, it may well be that there's disagreement in the organization about this, and having those disagreements ahead of time and in a situation where it's not actually holding up work, and it's more you can have thoughtful discussion and take the time to think about things and work your way through these questions before the event actually happens is critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in terms of that recovery strategies, it's then talking about the communication plan. How to communicate with staff. If if you're expecting to be able to communicate with staff via email, and your email servers in your office, that might be something to reconsider. How to consider communication whenever those primary methods of communication aren't available. It might mean getting cell phone numbers for staff and working through the communication plan like that. There might be, as we talked about at the very beginning, this is not just an IT-related function, but there might be some considerations around facilities. Where are you going to resume if your office location isn't available? Who are your critical resources? I mean, this is going to require people to do the work, and so if they're affected by the flu, or their power's out where they are and they can't access the internet or do work, are you gonna, how can you protect and remediate against that? And then again, identifying those critical business processes and focusing on restoring access to those first. And having that agreement, again, as Steve mentioned, before you go into a disaster, as opposed to trying to figure out that during a disaster is key.
Yeah, and it's when you get into these details. So you have these recovery strategies. You need to sort of have a strategy for sort of each of the different risks that you've identified. It's when you get into these details that it's like the complications start to emerge. Like, the funny catch-22 where, okay, well we have the list of everybody's cell numbers, and we're going to use that, do a phone tree. If if our IT systems go down, that's how we'll communicate with each other until we figure out how to, restore things. But that phone tree and that list, where do we store that? We store that in our file server in our IT systems, and so you can't get to it because it's down. So thinking about those things and anticipating them is sort of part of this strategy planning stage. It's also here that you like identify or evaluate whether your systems the strategies are meeting your business objectives. So, for example, the question about where do you resume your operations or restore your operations. So like Community IT has two different tiers of its managed backup service. And the most popular one, the less expensive one, allows restoration, very good restoration of very recent backups, but back to your site. So it's very good if you have, lost hardware or something like that. You get it back onto your site, and then you can restore your systems. If, however, the whole office is gone, and you may not have a place to restore to for several weeks because of some event. The higher tier, and I'm not selling it necessarily at all. I think it's quite a bit more expensive, and I think a lot of our clients are moving so many of their IT functions to cloud services anyway that this is becoming less and less of an important offering. But it's something that some clients do want. Our higher tier backup allows us to restore the backups to our own data center, so that those clients could potentially, work from home, connect to our data center to get their IT resources, once the recovery has taken place, and then presumably we would fail it back over to, a new site once that new site opened, whether that was several weeks or months later. So you don't sort of work all that out until you've done planning around what is going to happen if our office is literally gone. And again, maybe the likelihood of your office being gone is pretty small, and all of that gets worked out as you do your recovery strategy. Also, I think I'll mention here that it's here also that you think about sort of risk reducing strategies also. This is not just recovery strategies, but also like what do we do to reduce risk? So maybe if email is our most critical thing, we do need to make sure that it's a cloud service, offered by Microsoft Office 365, because we know that has much more redundancies and business continuity capability than having email in our own office on an on-premise server.
Yeah, Steve, I think that's a good way to bring it together, and through those discussions and conversations that you'll have around, what are our mission critical systems, what do we place the most value on, can certainly make those investments in, kind of improving business continuity or reducing the risk, can make those investments maybe a little bit easier to make.
Yep. So once you get all those plans made, you need to document it, inventory it, put all that stuff together. Here's what we're going to do when this happens. Here's what we're going to do when this happens. Here's how we're going to deal with the facilities, the vendors. All of that needs to be put into your disaster recovery plan or your business continuity plan. I don't know. I feel like Community IT's was like 40 pages. something like, I mean, it was lengthy, and it talked a lot about all the different things that we do on a regular basis and how we're going to, how each of those operational things would be impacted by, the different kinds of disasters and what steps we would take, what workarounds we'd have in place while there was a recovery happening, down to the level of detail that, our ticketing system, which is sort of how we make money at the end of the day, we bill for tickets that our clients open with us, that we would use pen and paper, and that we think we're pretty confident we could get away with pen and paper for 2-3 days if we had to, and then after our systems were recovered, we would have to transcribe those back into our system for billing purposes. All that's documented. It was a lengthy process, but there was a satisfaction of getting it done, and also sort of knowing, okay, we sort of have some plans in place, and it wasn't until we did that we worked out things like the cell phone text messaging system that we put in place and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, the most important thing then is to actually, how do you know your plan works? I mean, as has been said, your backups is only good as your ability to restore, and I think to that end, your disaster recovery or business continuity plan is only as good as your ability to execute on it. So performing a drill is kind of the key piece and maybe the gold standard, and it doesn't mean necessarily that you need to yank the power out of your server room or do something drastic, but it may mean you have a deliberate and planned approach to test various components of your business continuity plan over time, just to make sure that things work as you expect. So, does your recovery system give you the ability to restore data in a timely manner? And if you have an expectation of being able to recover your file server within 4 hours, does that mean that you can download all that information if you're just using a cloud backup solution? So I think having that process to say here's our assumption, here's our process, and then actually going to test that is the key piece, and it really is the kind of the final step. The final step is not the document being delivered, but the final step is really performing the drill to make sure that the plan works as you expect it to. Again, understanding that communication throughout the organization, and then the final piece is after you're able to test components, kind of go back and, as Steve said earlier, this should be a living document. It shouldn't just be done once and sat on a shelf, but as things change over time, that needs to be incorporated into the plan, and ensure that it meets the expectations and continues to meet the expectations as systems move and grow and change, and continue to evolve. So we'll have a little bit of time now to talk about in practice. So in August of last year, August 11th, as you can see from the email from our CFO, we came into the building, and as I opened up the front door to the office, I was greeted by several inches of water on the floor. We're on the 8th floor of a building in DC, and as it had turned out, the building, or the floor above us, the fan in their server room overheated and started smoking, which set off the sprinklers, which then rained down for a couple of hours and flooded everything in the building. So instead of going and having our Tuesday morning staff meeting, we had to make alternate plans. So the great thing was that even though our office was flooded and unavailable, we don't actually have much IT equipment in our office, and that was by design. So when we knew we were a couple years ago, after we had done this business continuity plan, we identified physical infrastructure as a key risk to us, and so we made plans to move things that we could to the cloud, and then things that we couldn't necessarily move to the cloud, we have to maintain some server equipment. We moved that to a data center where there's a much higher level of uptime and kind of physical infrastructure availability. because it's, the likelihood is not, that maybe your server catches on fire or something, but but something in your building or some other physical infrastructure that actually causes the disruption in access to your resources.
You were talking about how these data centers, they take you for their little tours, and they show you the big tank full of diesel fuel that if for whatever reason that there's the utility electricity goes out, they have 3 days worth of diesel fuel to run the generators for the entire plant, and they also have contracts with diesel delivery service that that they're at the top of the list. And it's all of these risks are people have thought about them, and it's absolutely true that that servers in someone's office are sort of at the lowest level in terms of controlling those risks, because there's just so much more that can go wrong with a building that's really more designed for people working in it than for being a data center. That doesn't mean that we're telling all of our clients that they need to invest in moving all their servers to a data center. I don't think that necessarily the cost-benefit balance makes sense for a lot of our clients, but for us, given the fact that like the monitoring systems that we maintain, that we promise our clients, that will stay up and will keep running, that for us it made sense to make that investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as an example, a basic matrix just to for this presentation, we kind of identified different services. Email, we're using Office 365, and then we made the decision that we really need to have a third-party backup system in place, and so we can meet the RTO and the RPO kind of requirements that we have internally. Same thing as Steve mentioned, our ticketing system that's in our data center. We're doing server image backups. We're doing data level backups, and we kind of have designed that around an 8-hour recovery time objective. We've got resources in the cloud and Amazon that give us a lot of flexibility there. But again, this was just a helpful exercise to go through to identify all those different technology platforms that are involved with us providing service to our clients, and how can we ensure that they are in the best position to be up and available for us to provide service to our constituents. So I wanted to have some time here at the end for some Q&A, and there have been some questions that have been coming on here, so I will take a look. So one question was, it'd be great to see that an organization's DR plan. So if anybody would like to share their organization's DR plan, please feel free to chat in. I think there are some good resources at TechSoup and also inside NGO for some very kind of specifics and detailed examples of that plan.
And we can, the question was also, would we be willing to share our plan? We might be able to share an anonymous version of it, so we'll look into that.
Yeah. Great. There's also some questions earlier about, kind of is the cloud ready for prime time in terms of backups? And I would say, so there's, kind of yes, asterisks. As I mentioned, the cloud, and there's a lot of great, kind of where we're talking about file level backups to protect, your file server, the files on your computer. They are great in that kind of single item recovery. So if you, delete a file, whatever you need to recover something, they're good for that purpose. But they're not so good if you need to, in this kind of disaster recovery scenario, if your server crashes because the hard drive fails and you need to recover your entire file system. If you have a 500 gig file server and you try to download all of that data, even with a big internet connection, that could take several days worth of time. So from that perspective, it's important to, again, do that testing. Can you recover, can you recover your file server in the time that you expect? And if not, maybe you need to augment that plan. The backup solution that we can use and implement includes a local component, so that in that disaster scenario, we have a separate device where we can restore data locally without relying on the internet. And so that's one way to address it. So the cloud is a great resource. Storage is cheap. It's not necessarily fast, and there is just a kind of a mechanical limitation of moving data across a wire. So it's important to guys understand that, particularly if you're trying to deal with restoring large amounts of data. The cloud can have some limitations, purely from a transportation perspective.
Yeah, that's a good. It depends. Someone asked if can a cloud-based solution replace? It looks like they have a disaster recovery site. Would a cloud solution be able to replace that? If someone has a DR site, could you stand up something comparable, let's say in Amazon Web Services?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that's definitely the direction that we're kind of going now. When we gave this, gave a kind of focused talk about backups and disaster recovery 3 years ago, the go-to recommendation was, kind of a full DR site and doing server replication. I think things have changed and improved so that bandwidth is cheaper, connectivity is better, and then quite frankly, Amazon and Azure as kind of the two predominant cloud services make it a lot easier to have that connection so that you can have some server resources staged there and then fail over those critical servers if you need to. And then honestly what we're seeing is that I think once organizations see how it's kind of how easy it is to actually spin up things in the cloud, then that becomes the primary location. And so instead of trying to build an exotic server room with all the bells and whistles, it's a lot more cost effective to put that in the cloud primarily and invest in a good internet connection, and then build out some of that DR and actually failover and redundancy in the cloud, as opposed to looking at your on-prem server infrastructure as where your primary location is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it used to be that you wanted to have stuff on-prem if nothing else because it was just talking to the servers was bandwidth intensive, and at least people in the office could have a good experience. But now bandwidth is just so good now that you can have a good experience even if the server's in some Amazon or Microsoft data center, 3-hour drive away.
Mm-hmm. One point I wanted to make, and this kind of goes back to one of the steps of the disaster recovery planning process in terms of prioritizing applications, and there were a couple of questions and comments around this earlier, is that you're not always, like, every department is going to feel like its applications should have the top priority. And I mean, email is something that everyone can agree on because everyone uses, but after that, um, as important as it is to have sort of a committee approach to trying to work this out, it's not always going to be possible to come to a consensus agreement. And I think that speaks to the importance and the need of having the executive leadership involved on some level from the beginning, because they might need to be called in to kind of make that final decision about whose application gets sort of top priority. So executive involvement and leadership is important from that perspective. It's also important to make sure that staff take these things seriously. Sometimes, when we have fire drills in the building, half the people stay at their desk and don't give it the attention that it needs. So having senior leadership can help kind of reinforce with the organization as a whole that this is serious and needs to be taken seriously. And I think along those lines, the board often has a responsibility to ensure that there's some sort of business continuity plan in place. And I think a lot of nonprofit boards take that. That's a concrete responsibility that they can have. Goes along with fundraising, disaster recovery planning, and recruiting are three things that boards can be sort of concretely involved in. And I think if it's on the board's radar, it's something that's likely going to get some attention from the organization.
Yeah, I think if you don't have that, Johan, I mean, what you don't want is just to have a, a pile of paper that has, people put a lot of energy into it and did a lot of work and did good work. But if it doesn't have leadership's backing and stamp of approval or the board's backing and stamp of approval, it is just a pile of paper. And when it actually comes to a situation where it's needed, it almost ends up not being worth much more than if you hadn't done it at all, because people can second guess it, like, well, I didn't know that. That's what you guys came up with. It's like you need to have all that, really firmly supported by leadership ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate the questions that we had today, and want to invite folks to sign up for our next webinar, where maybe thankfully it won't just be Steve and I talking, but we'll have one of our colleagues, our senior engineer Galen Wenger, talk a little bit about Windows 10 for the enterprise. So he'll be looking at managing, deploying, and customizing Windows 10 for your organization. So it's something we've certainly been doing a lot of testing and learning on. So I'm happy to have him share what he's learned as part of that process.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Steve. That was a fantastic webinar, very informative, and a lot of good information for everyone who's planning or needs to be planning around disaster recovery and business continuity. So when you exit the webinar, you're going to be asked to fill out a short survey. Please take a few seconds to do that. We've been doing this webinar series for many years now, and it's something that we really enjoy doing, and we want to make sure it's valuable to the nonprofit community. And in order to continue to improve it, we really need your feedback. So if you could take a few minutes to fill out the survey, that would be great. Like I said before, if you missed anything, we will be sending out a link to the slides and recording within the next day or two. And you can look for that also on Twitter and on our Facebook page, as well as our LinkedIn page. And please follow us in all of those places. So we thank everyone for joining us today, and wish you all the best. Good luck with your disaster recovery planning, and we look forward to seeing you again in March as we discuss Windows 10 in the enterprise. Take care.